In this video, we're going to look at the last part of Swinburne's positive case against Sterba's logical problem of evil. We're going to look at Swinburne's take on goods and evils, and we're going to look at how he applies that to the case of horrendous evils, which is at the center of Sterba's argument against God. Let's jump in. So the first thing it's good to point out is that Swinburne builds his case by saying, look, God provides us a lot of goods that don't logically depend on the permission of evils. For instance, he could provide us with these sorts of goods, pleasurable sensations, just the feeling good, which reminds me, grab yourself a giant cup of coffee and, just sip coffee and enjoy. That's a pleasurable sensation. Then we have good health. We have singing, dancing, and running. We have learning truths about the world, especially in groups. So these are the sorts of goods that God could provide us without permitting any evils. Now, Swinburne starts building his case by discussing libertarian free will. This is the sort of free will often regarded as agent causal or event causal freedom. That is, you have sort of the ability to go either way when it comes to the causal order. It's up to the agent to make the choice one way or another, and such a free choice requires not being caused to make the choice by prior causal conditions or any external force. So if you're truly free in that regard, Swinburne thinks there are great goods that require that sort of significant freedom. And he says further, quote, given libertarian free will, it's not logically possible for an omnipotent God to give us the freedom to choose between good and evil, and yet cause us to choose the good. If God gives us this choice, he thereby permits the possibility of us making much moral evil. And so, given the large number of humans and the large number of free choices they make, it is very probable that there will be much moral evil in the world. So, because we have this sort of freedom, if God really has given us libertarian free will, God can't, as an agent outside of us, force us to make a choice one way or another. We wouldn't be choosing freely were that to happen. Then it's the case that we can choose good or evil, and based on what we choose, we start to reinforce our character in that direction. And eventually, we become reinforced with habits towards making good choices or reinforced with habits towards making bad choices. And God thinks it's a great good for us to have the freedom to choose the sort of people we will be. Now, what is a greater good? What are some of the goods that we can allow or use our freedom in order to secure? Well, being able to influence others. We have the choices to improve others' lives and the world using our freedom. Being able to make the choice is a great good, and there's a further good that sort of falls out of that. If we make a good choice, we have that further great good, namely causing a positive effect, affecting the world and others for the good. Now, how does this connect to natural evils, right? So you might think, well, okay, libertarian free will can make sense of why there'd be a lot of suffering in the world because people can make bad choices and further reinforce their bad choices and become really evil people and do horrible stuff. And how does that connect to natural evil? Well, there can be certain negligence concerning natural degradation. As he says, quote, we can only have the opportunity to make important moral choices and so deep responsibility for others and ourselves if the normal alternative to not doing good to others is negligence. Doing nothing, when doing nothing involves allowing others to suffer as a result of natural processes. Hence, the need for natural evils of suffering caused by disease, accident, and old age. So Swinburne thinks God allows for natural evils because we have the chance to actually, do something to help people. It's not a good thing they suffer disease, accident, and old age, but it's this is the world we find ourselves in, and God allowing us to come alongside others gives us the choice again, even when the people suffer natural evils, to make a choice for good to help people. Or if we suffer a horrible disease or accident, we can choose to embrace it in a way that's good. And I just saw this, actually. A gentleman on YouTube who does like a chiropractic type channel got cancer. He's very young, I think in his early 40s. And it was very aggressive and advanced, and it took him down in 3-ish years. But he cataloged his journey. He built a community of people who were also going through cancer, and a lot of good came out of that. He chose to use his freedom in a way that really positively impacted others and the world. So that's just one example why God might allow these natural evils. Now, there's also the good of care and courage, and I was mentioning this other. It's especially good, he says, that sometimes we should have the opportunity to show courage over a long period of time in the face of serious suffering, and thereby show great commitment to the good. And it's especially good that sometimes we should be able to help those who are seriously ill or deprived, for providing help at the time of their greatest need is an act of deep significance. And I know this to be the case because my mom, who's a nurse, worked for a gentleman who got ALS, or also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, which is completely debilitating. He ended up intubated, and machine breathing for him, lost all bodily function. It's the same thing that Stephen Hawking had, and you end up in a wheelchair and so on. But his name was Ted. Ted chose to use that for the good, and it allowed the opportunity for my mom and others to come alongside him, and he actually himself used it for the good. Namely, he kind of went on and had a whole computer system set up. And this was early on in the adaptive technology days with computers. And I'm sure he made advances in it as well, because they were having to cobble stuff together, and then people were asking about it. And so that's another example. And it was a long battle with ALS. He beat the odds of how long he would live by a long shot, and continued to be a great inspiration for a lot of people. In addition, I mentioned the good of character formation earlier, and this is something Swinburne thinks is very good, and why God would give us such freedom, because we can freely heed or repress our conscience and our desires, right? So we have certain things that eat at us that says that's not right or that's unjust. And we can take action and become the sort of person that does good things, for instance, in the face of injustice. And that shapes us to be a virtuous person, a person who cares about the good, a person who loves others well. And so it's a good thing to have the ability to shape our character. And we can also shape our desires. We may have a temptation or a desire to do something we know is wrong, but we can resist that temptation and strengthen our ability to resist it, and again, shape our character in a positive direction, such that we're not falling to temptation, and which ultimately leads to destruction, as you see in the case of recent pastors who have come out with infidelity issues. Diddy is the big one. Oh my goodness. He reinforced through all those years of just having unchecked power, he reinforced evil character. You can see, but it's just the whole case is riddled with evil. So that's an example of shaping your character in a negative direction. But we can shape our character in the positive direction as well. And that's a great good. Again, the good to help others cope with natural diseases. I mentioned my mom helping Ted with his long-term battle with ALS, including applying the good of rationality to discover cures for diseases. So another thing good is intellectual discovery. It's good to find out truths and discover things. And additionally, like I mentioned, scientific inquiry and discovery. Quote, scientists can only discover cures if there are regular processes producing the diseases. So you have to have what's called nomological stability or order. Their laws of nature have to be regular, and things have to work a certain way. And in order to produce the diseases, in order to reliably be able to combat them, and they can only learn what these are by studying many populations and studying under which circumstances some disease is transmitted and under which circumstances it's not transmitted. So for the great good of this choice of investigating, or not bothering to investigate, remember that's that negligence, right? There is required the necessary evil of actual disease. So in order to have the great good of scientific inquiry and discovery, it's logically necessary that people suffer diseases and get diseases. Now, also, it's good for us to be able to shape our character under uncertainty. We aren't 100% certain of how things are going to turn out. And if God gave us all the knowledge of cause and effect, number one, it would completely overwhelm us. But imagine we could somehow have the ability to fully understand the nature of cause and effect. Making moral decisions would be easy. You'd be like, oh yeah, if this leads to this, then 15 years down the road, this is going to come about. So I'm going to do this right here because this is good and it's going to have this ripple effect. And being able to be in an initial state of ignorance and then needing to discover the causal nexus of the world is a good thing to allow us to freely choose to do the right thing even when it's hard. So Swinburne thinks that if we had all this knowledge of cause and effect and we knew the far-reaching consequences of our choices, in some sense, that would take away our ability to freely choose in the moment to go one direction or the other. We would actually, making decisions under uncertainty would be the kind of thing that we would need to go out and discover how things work, and then to learn about them because we're not sure, we don't know everything, and then we can freely choose to do the right thing, as opposed to, hey, I already know how everything's going to play out, and maybe that knowledge plus the desire for good just sort of necessitates a certain choice. Now, also, Swinburne thinks the good of being of use to God and others means that your life is not wasted. Quote, whenever God allows some natural evil to occur to a person, and in particular causes that person to suffer, in order to provide some good for another person, for example, the free choice of how to react to this suffering, then that person who's suffering is benefited as well. Why? You might say, it would be better if they didn't have the disease. It would be better if Ted didn't get ALS, right? Well, why was it good for my mom to have the free choice to be a nurse and to choose to night after night come and work an overnight shift? She worked a graveyard shift with him because he had to have his tubes, changed and cleaned and everything, and someone needed to be on call right there with him 24 hours a day. So she is of use by God to help others. And she's also of use to God. She plays a role in God's plan, or the person who suffers, Ted, plays a role in God's plan for my mom to make those choices, to be virtuous, to come alongside him, and to be of use to the good source of being in the redemption of his creation is an enormous good. So playing a role in God's plan, having the ability to come alongside others that are suffering and choosing to do so, having to make that choice and choosing to do that can create good effects not only for the person who's suffering, but also the bigger scope of God's plan in terms of how he's redeeming his creation and superintending different things to happen and ultimately being sovereign over it. Now, request others suffer evil. So this is where it gets a little tough. Now, you might be with me to this point. But you might need to get your giant coffee and, buckle up. This is where a lot of people jump off the ship with Swinburne. So he says things that he follows it to its logical conclusion, but it can be a little bit of a tough pill to swallow. So he says, quote, "The starving, the persecuted, and the abused are the vehicle whereby alone the comfortable and self-obsessed can have a serious free choice of whether to be saved from self-obsession and learn to give their time and money and energy to helping others, and thereby they are of use to God himself. So those who go through starving, persecution, and abuse can be a vehicle, or are the vehicle, where people who may be like, I ain't got time for that, or I don't want to deal with that, can say, you know what, no, that's selfish. I really do need to help this person that's been put in my life and they're struggling. And, but the question becomes, where that's a tough pill to swallow, is like, really? God allows these people to starve and to be persecuted and abused, and a lot aren't helped, right? So just to have the possibility for self-obsessed people to go out of their way and get over their self-obsession and become of use to others and to God himself. Well, I mean, it is true though. Think about it. Imagine there's no starving, no persecution, and there's no abused people. I mean, there would be no help organizations. There'd be no need to donate to charity. There would be, imagine there's also no natural evil, no diseases. We'd just be walking around. What would we do? Well, we'd have fun, but it would be like a little playground. And, there wouldn't be the possibility of overcoming our selfish desires. In fact, we would probably become a lot more self-absorbed, right? I don't need to help others. Everybody's good. So I'm just going to, go play golf and just do what I do and just look out for me. So, again, that's a little bit of a tough pill to swallow. And now Swinburne considers another objection to his views. So, well, okay. But look, Swinburne, this is something Sterba picks up on in our discussion, in our chat on Coffee with Philosophers. So, Swinburne thinks, look, first he raises the objection. It seems unfair to those that suffer for others' soul-making, right? So that's what I was getting at. Like, really? These people are just vehicles for people to build their character and make good choices and become virtuous people? It seems unfair, especially because the distribution is so unequal. And this is something Sterba really picks up on. I think he has a good point against Swinburne in this regard. So he said, the objection goes as follows. Some have significant free choices, which make great differences to others, but do not suffer much themselves. And while many suffer from disease and other natural evils, others suffer very little from natural evils. So, there's a very unlevel playing field in order for everyone to have an equal opportunity at soul making. And this is actually one of Sterba's big points, as you'll see when you watch our episode. So it's natural for the sufferers to feel that the distribution of evils is not fair. This world is not fair. Look at this person. They're just going through life having no major problems. And here I am. All these problems are being heaped on me. And here we're imagining, there goes the arms again. I'll just get a quick shot of that so you can see the arms there. Trying to really get those arms in action. Philosophy arms, philosophy hands. You got to always have your philosophy hands ready. Where was I? I have no clue. No, you might think, gosh, that's unfair. But given the earlier assumption that for the vast majority of humans, this is Swinburne's response, their life on earth is on balance good, God does these sufferers no wrong. So even though the playing field's unlevel, some suffer horrendously for the good of others, to be able to build their soul, to help them. It's ultimately the case that almost the vast majority of people, on balance, have good lives on earth. And therefore, God does these sufferers no wrong. And remember, God is the good benefactor. And a good benefactor requires that you provide more good than bad over the whole life of the individual. Now, also, God, like a good parent, gives different assignments to different children. Hey, Augustine, I need you to go pick up your toys in this room. Hey, Soren, I need you to pick up the toys in this room. Okay, so you guys each have different assignments. Well, God would probably give assignments totally different, right? Christy, I need you to become a lab tech and help people in great need with their, laboratory needs so that doctors can get good results so that they can better treat and care for individuals. And in that way, God is acknowledging their individuality. Christy, I designed you to be the sort of person that loves science and would be great as a lab tech. And their need to play a particular role in the scheme of salvation. So not only that, but I need you to be a witness to people at your work, such that whether through words or just by deeds and how you treat people, they say, wow, something's really different about Christy. Wow. She believes in Jesus. I wonder if there's a connection there, and so on. Now, also, there is joy in being found worthy of suffering for God. So there's a venerable history of this in the life of saints, in the life of people of the church who have suffered horrendously and found great joy, not because they were suffering, but because they were found worthy to suffer by the Lord, and the Lord Jesus suffered mightily. So God found me worthy to suffer the sort of suffering, or to suffer horribly like Jesus suffered horribly. And that's another way of identifying with Christ. Joni Eareckson Tada suffers horrendously. She paraplegic, but just has horrendous pain. And she talks about that. She says in her moments of pain early in the morning when she can barely stand it, she thinks of Christ suffering. And she, in that moment, identifies with Christ's suffering in a way that I will never identify with unless something like that happens to me. Quote, to be allowed to suffer for a good cause is a privilege, even if, and Joni Eareckson Tada has used that suffering for so much great good, bringing people to Christ. She's made a huge impact, even if the only good brought about by the suffering is that the sufferer has made himself a saint. Now, a saint is a very specific thing. That's where you go just above and beyond just soul making, forming yourself to have a good character. You repudiate evil. You really seek to love. And maybe it is like a soul making person at the extreme can become a saint. And your life is just marked by great pursuit of love and truth, and ultimately representing God well. Not being bitter when others neglect them, always cheerful, and always concerned for the well-being of others. So Mother Teresa, think about all the saints in history, and not just saints that have been canonized by the Catholic Church, but others who have done great stuff. Their concern is almost always for the well-being of others. And they're not just a self-absorbed like rock star, who's just partying it up. And again, this is like Diddy, right? Just self-absorbed and creating a kingdom of evil that serves all his selfish desires and all his temptations and quirks and kinks and Anyway, the apostles flogged on the order of the Jewish Sanhedrin rejoiced. That's another example. The apostles that were flogged by the Jewish Sanhedrin rejoiced that they were considered worthy to suffer dishonor for the sake of the name of Jesus, right? So, in summary, every moral evil is such that God allowing its agent the free choice of causing it is a good to that agent. And the harder it is to make the good choice, the greater the value of the choice if it is made. right? So even struggling in the face of temptation and choosing to do what's good, even though you want to do what's wrong in some sense, that will have even greater value. Or choosing to help others. Virtually every natural evil, so that's moral evil, virtually every natural evil is such that the sufferer has the free choice of whether to react to it well or badly. I'm sure if you just think back about people you've seen suffer horrendously due to disease and accident, there's been people who have been examples of great suffering well and examples of people who have suffered poorly. And so God thinks it's a great good to have that choice of how you will respond to the suffering. These evils provide the framework for the exercise of human love for each other when it is most needed and most valued. Think about it. When you're in a season of intense pain and suffering, and someone comes along and just is gracious and kind, it means the world, right? Because you're in your moment of need, and they have reached out in love and met you in your moment of need and comforted you and come alongside you. And it's such a great good, and it's a valuable thing that God gives us the choice to come alongside others in their, especially in their moments of greatest need. Now, additionally, Swinburne remember, Sterba is analogizing the state and parents, and then he's saying, hey, if parents can't, permit horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions, the state, an ideally just state, shouldn't do that, then God, all the more so, should do the same. And if God exists, we shouldn't see these horrendous evils, right? But Swinburne notes that, for instance, cruelty to children, the state could just prevent that by removing children after birth away from the natural parents and educating them in a home staffed entirely by caring foster parents. State could very largely prevent rape by the powerful deterrent of installing closed-circuit televisions in every room, every house, on every corner, and every street, and having these continually watched by police who would immediately arrest any rapist and get them in prison for many years. But again, very few liberal-minded citizens would support this measure. That is, very few citizens who think freedom is of a great value would support such a thing. It's way too intrusive, right? So these two examples show that liberal-minded citizens think there are comparable goods which would be eliminated if the state took sufficiently stringent measures to prevent rape and cruelty to children, right? What are those goods? Well, the good of biological parents being able to raise their kiddos, which also, remember, we started out with Swinburne on rights, and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 16, the right for biological parents to raise their own children seems to be implied by that, and the good of privacy in our personal lives, which seems to be explicitly stated in Article 12. Privacy is a huge one. The state could be way intrusive and prevent all sorts of bad things from happening, but then our freedom to have privacy would be violated, and we value privacy. We value being able to be parents and to make choices of how we'll parent. Sometimes we do good, and, honestly, sometimes we mess up. I had a moment where I was less than a great parent, right? And I was like, really? I could have done so much better there. And so I apologized to my son, and I said, I'm going to try better next time. Now it was nothing major, but it was enough to where I was like, that wasn't good. I'm going to choose to be a better parent, right? And that's a good choice that I can shape my character. Now, if God were preventing, or if the state were preventing any sort of, thing happening, then that would be a huge intrusion on people. And even though, for instance, no kids would have anything bad happen to them, it would still, there are these comparable goods that would be eliminated by preventing those evils from happening, right? And there are those comparable goods that are worth it. Hence, Okay, if we share those intuitions that would be too intrusive for the state to do that, what this shows is that the evils are not so bad that no one would ever be justified in allowing them to occur. A state would be justified in allowing them to occur if it would not be possible for it to prevent them except by eliminating these good states. So remember, Sterba's argument is strong. It says God should always prevent these horrendous evils, and a just state would do so. Good parents do so, so God all the more so should prevent these things. And Swinburne looks at the case of parents, looks at the case of the state, and says there are these other compensating or comparable goods that are logically entailed or connected to the permission of certain evils. And were God to eliminate the evils, God would eliminate the goods. Now, as he says here, it would be possible, logically, for God, now we're going to apply this to God, to eliminate rape, eliminate strong sexual desires, or our free will to choose whether to yield to those desires. God could just override it all the time, such that we only have positive desires and we have no choice about whether we'll choose to act on those positive desires or bad ones, because there's only good ones and God's sort of forcing us to always choose the right ones. But he suggests that having strong sexual desires are great goods, especially within marriage, and not only for having kids, but also the pleasure that comes from it, and the good of us having the choice about whether or not to yield to those desires just is the good of libertarian free will. So libertarian free will, we have a choice. We're not necessitated to go one way or the other by our desires. We can choose to exercise our freedom in a way that's positive. And a lot of those goods that we mentioned would not be logically possible were God to eliminate all evils or all horrendous evils. And quote, God could eliminate cruelty to children in some way other than by taking them away from their natural parents, but it would not be logically possible for him to eliminate it without eliminating either the free will of the parents. They don't want their kids to be taken away, to treat their children well or badly. They don't want to be forced like a robot to always treat their kids good. I am perfect parent. I am perfect parent. Da, da, da. Or the responsibility of parents for the upbringing of their own children, which is a good for the parents and also normally, despite its obvious bad aspects, for the children. So normally it's a great good for parents to be raised for kids to be raised by their parents. Now there are bad parents who treat their kids horribly. But were God to ensure that there were only good parents, he would have to override their freedoms. And were he to ensure that kids were never harmed, he would either have to override the parents' desires, so they always desire the good, and they have no free choice about whether to go good or bad. And so Swinburne says, quote, I suggest that it is no way obvious that the goods which would be eliminated, if God eliminated the possibility of rape and cruelty to children, are inferior to the goods which would be eliminated by the state if the state took those measures. So, hence, there's no justification for the view that these social evils are such that any God ought to have prevented the possibility of their occurrence. I suggest that a similar dialectic would show a similar conclusion with respect to other widespread social evils, that by allowing these evils to occur, God makes possible the occurrence of comparable goods. So we have parents being allowed to make choices, good or evil, but that's a good thing. They can choose the sort of parents they'll be, and they can choose for the good to raise their kids. But it means the possibility of them choosing bad and having parents that are bad, and kids are treated cruelly, unfortunately. Same thing with the state. The state could eliminate all cruelty to children and possibility of rape, but it would be hugely intrusive, violate privacy, and override strong sexual desires, just we wouldn't have the ability to choose to act on those, especially for God. And same thing goes for God, right? So state can allow the great good of privacy, even though it means people will abuse it and won't be caught, or will choose to do things and will get away with it. Same thing with God. And God can allow these compensating goods, and even though it means the permission of certain evils. And remember, this also gets back to what we talked about in the last video. God has all the more right to do that than parents and the state, because God is all the more responsible for our existence. So, in summary, he has conceded there's a small minority of humans whose openness to suffering benefits others, but whose own life on earth are on balance not worth living. So he acknowledges that. And his argument has the consequence that God has an obligation to compensate these humans as a good benefactor, because he's a good benefactor, for the evil they suffer in this life by giving them a good afterlife, so that the total life of such people will be on balance good, and that I've argued in virtue of his perfect goodness, he will do this. This point is crucially relevant in the case of babies abused by their parents who die before they can get any pleasure out of life at all. So that is a tough case where kids are abused and they don't survive, and you think, oh my gosh, their life wasn't on balance good on earth. Well, if God is good, God's obligated to provide them with an amazing afterlife and to compensate them. And it will be their life as a whole, given that afterlife, will be on balance good. And God is good, so God will do that to them. All right, so now let's go ahead and let's get on to horrendous evils. Let's do this thing. Let's do what we were born to do. Okay, so this is the last part of what Swinburne's case is in the book, Could a Good God Permit So Much Suffering? His debate book with between him and Sterba. And then you might say, well, what about horrendous evils? I mean, some of the things we mentioned in part 4 were bad, definitely bad. But now we'll just, blow it up to the case of the Holocaust or the Gulag, where there's this, institutional aspect, churning out evil just in a horrible way. What about those things? And so what Swinburne's going to say is there's no bright line, no obvious divider between significant and horrendous evils. So the debate between Richard and Jim is a matter of the quantity of evil morally permissible for God to permit. So Sterba thinks horrendous evils are of a different quality or kind than significant evils, lesser evils. Richard thinks there's no line between those things. And when we get to horrendous evil, we just have more suffering, more people suffering in a more horrible way. We just have insignificant evils, someone suffering horribly in a less horrible way. But those two things are not of a different kind. It's all suffering. We're just talking about the quantity of suffering. At least that's Richard's point. Now, let's take us back to the old pandemic. Yeah, you might not want to think about that old pandemic because it cramped your style, your life, and unfortunately so many people died, and it was horrible. And we had to shop like this. Look at this. Look at this, people. They're wearing their masks. Okay, that's good. But they're wearing gloves. And then, I don't know if you had this happen to you, but you would wash the bags. You would spray down the boxes in the early days because we didn't know how it was being transmitted. I mean, we kind of knew, but it was like we didn't know a lot about COVID-19. And so it was, again, like, okay, so let's just take the pandemic. Worldwide, lots of death, horrible suffering. Was God morally obligated to not... was this beyond the pale? Or was this horrendous evil somehow, different than significant evil in a way that, like, God for sure should have prevented this. Well, let's take a look. If God permitted or allowed one person to suffer, then God is permitted to allow many to suffer. So that's kind of Swinburne's point. Like, if God can allow this in an individual's case, then we're talking about numbers, and given everything he said about God as a good benefactor, it's not clear that God wouldn't be permitted to allow greater numbers to suffer. It's a numbers thing. So, quote, the mere number of sufferers cannot affect the cogency of a justification of God allowing some evil. Like, at what point would you say, well, this is just too many? And then you could get into sort of I don't know, you could do like a Sorites paradox where you just add one more sufferer to the heap. Not to the heap. You just keep adding sufferers, and you say, well, at what point, one sufferer is not a horrendous evil. 2 people suffering is not a horrendous evil. 3 people suffering is not a horrendous evil. And then you go all the way out to like 1 million people suffering is not a horrendous evil. And you're like, no, intuitively that is a horrendous evil. And then you're like, well, there's great vagueness. At what point did we cross that line, right? And so something like that might be operating in the background. And for Swinburne, just the pure numbers of suffering, like giant worldwide pandemic, can affect the cogency of God allowing some evil, because it might be tied to a great good. And what we were talking about earlier in part 4 applies, like the advances in medical technology, all the care that had to come out, all the people who had to choose to help others. I mean, it really applies in the case of a pandemic. And so God could allow for such a horrendous evil, a lot of suffering on a mass-wide scale, in order for God to logically, because there are goods that are logically tied to that suffering, and those goods are comparable. Now, also, another great good is the freedom to finally shape your character. So we talked about like the ability to shape your soul. Well, now we're talking about what's the final destination for your soul, right? Horrendous evils afford this good. The freedom to become like the sort of person you'll be on earth and in the afterlife. So God gives us the ultimate say of this sort of way we shape our character in the final sense. That is, good persons have the opportunity for saint making, right? So like we can become the sort of people who are saint-like in that relevant sense. Or bad persons have the opportunity to become very evil. So we can choose to shape our character in a final direction where we become really good or really bad. And Swinburne thinks that's a great good, and horrendous evils offer that opportunity. Now, I made this chart because I think this is helpful to see in order to sort of look at the difference between Swinburne and Sterba on this point. So Swinburne thinks if God is good, God is going to give us the opportunity for the ability to become superlatively great, or he's going to give us the freedom to become superlatively evil. So that's what the 100 is. Swinburne thinks like God gives us the ability to become 100% good, so to speak, or 100% evil, right? Now, Sterba, and this is the possibility for shaping our character in light of horrendous evil, but Sterba thinks, whoa, no, God should step in. People can still shape their character and still make their soul better. They can still become virtuous in the face of significant evil. In fact, Sterba's further point is, hey, look, if God allows this horrendous suffering, it cuts in to the freedom of others to choose to shape their soul. And this gets back to that worry about an uneven playing field for soul making. Isn't the distribution of opportunity for soul making unfair, unjust, and like unjust state, and so on? So Sterba thinks, look, we have the ability to shape ourselves for good, even if we can't, in the face of horrendous evil, become saints, he thinks that's okay. We can still become very virtuous. I put a 75 there. And then also, we can, because there's not horrendous evil, we can only become evil to a certain degree because God would be permitting all the horrendous evil, right? So we can do some bad stuff. And maybe I should have that up at 75, but I put 50 because God's going to be stepping in a lot, especially in light of the knock-on effects of doing bad stuff. So God might be permitting horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions for sure, but then he might be doing, preventing people from, like, you can get started down that road and then he's going to stop you, right? So you can't really shape your character much to become very evil, although he might allow that you can shape your character to become good. So you can see there's like this discrepancy about the range of possibilities to shape your character for good or evil between Swinburne and Sterba. Now, why is saint making such a great good? We're going to, Swinburne hits on this theme a lot. He thinks it's a really great good. You may be aware of Trent Doherty's book on animal pain and suffering, and his theodicy is a saint-making theodicy, and a lot have found it very attractive. Well, Swinburne is very much arguing in that vein. He says, quote, good parents want their children to live good lives and will encourage them to do so by word and example. And sometimes, as I argued in section 2, which is one thing we talked about earlier in part, I think, 3, put them in a position where they have the opportunity to make a choice how to react in an unpleasant situation. But clearly there's a narrow limit to the unpleasant situations that a human parent would be justified in imposing on a human child, right? So, as he says, quote, a perfectly good God, being so much more the author of our existence than our parents, and so much more knowledgeable about the effects of actions, the knock-on effects I was talking about, than humans, and able to compensate sufferers for any suffering they would endure, would rightly be very ambitious for the humans he created. And this is that 100% that Swinburne's getting at. He would be zealous for us to become saints and want to give us every opportunity to achieve that, right? Within reason, within whatever's possible. He wouldn't be content with humans being moderately good people, enjoying a fairly worthwhile life. He would want us to be saints. So Swinburne's big knock against Sterba's argument, just in a very general sense, is like, doesn't God want more for us than this? Doesn't God want us to give us the opportunity to become the best we can be in terms of goodness, even if it means allowing for us to become the best we can be in terms of badness? And isn't that a more interesting and just full of more opportunity and goodness sort of life? And he thinks like there's like a low grade opportunity for soul making that Sterba's asking for. Remember those limits, you can only go so far. And so, yeah, like God wouldn't want us just to be moderately good people in the not the bad place, not the good place, in the middle place. Just sort of, life's pretty good. I'm a pretty good person. No, God would want to give us the opportunity for becoming the best possible person we could be. Additionally, there's no suffering in heaven. So remember, God's all the more powerful and can compensate others for their suffering in a way that human parents can't, in a way the state can't. And so, quote, greater love has no human than this, to lay down their life for their friends. John 15:13, said Jesus. If someone makes that ultimate commitment to the good in the face of severe suffering, it follows from the principle he talked about earlier that God must provide for every human a life which is on balance a good life, and that he must provide for those suffering such severe suffering a compensatory life after death. But for those who freely make that ultimate commitment to suffer well, a good God, and to undergo that, would surely think them worthy of an endless life whereby they could have perfect free will to choose between innumerable good alternatives, but would at last be spared having any bad desires, and so pains or other suffering necessary on earth for them to choose what sort of person they are to be. There would be no need for suffering in heaven. And that's a great comfort for those who believe in Jesus, to know that if I am with God in the afterlife, that there will be no tears, there will be no suffering, there will be no pain. All will be made right by God in the future. Also, there's a blessedness that comes in the afterlife. So making that final choice to embrace God is a good on earth. It's a good thing to, choose to walk with Jesus on earth and in the afterlife, because we can deepen our worship and understanding of God. We can help people continue to choose God in heaven and on earth. We can truly be free from temptation and sin and not have residual selfish desires. And we can be eternally happy in heaven. These are the sort of the blessings or the blessedness we'll enjoy as we're walking with God face to face in the afterlife. But there's a guy carousing in that picture, a suitor making advances, and she seems to be saying, no, I don't want I don't want you, I don't want this. He's continuing to pursue her. Well, likewise, God thinks, Swinburne's good, but he's not God, sorry. Swinburne, not God, Swinburne thinks, like a good suitor would eventually take no for an answer. I mean, if you're a bad suitor, you're just a creep, and you continue pursuing someone even when they've said no, but that's bad. A good suitor would genuinely put in the best effort they could to woo or to win the relationship with that person, but would ultimately take no for an answer, and God gives us a final choice to shape our character into the certain person we want to be. Given the permission of horrendous evil, some will use that freedom to shape themselves into a person that's totally evil. So think of Hitler or Jeffrey Dahmer. And such people will reject the good and all that it represents. And God will provide an opportunity to shape our character for the good, but he gives us that ultimate choice whether to embrace him or reject him. And like I mentioned, a good suitor should be willing to accept rejection of a marriage proposal in the end. God should be willing to take no for an answer in the end, just like a good suitor. Even though God has, attempted to woo that person, if they are finally evil and they reject all that's good and their heart is hardened in a way that God can't, allow them to freely choose him without sort of like overriding their freedom and forcing them to love God, like God's going to force them to love him, then God should be willing to say, okay, that's what you want. That's who you've become. I accept that. Now, here, before we get to Coffee with Philosophers, here's the state of the debate. Let's see where we're at in the dialectic. Swinburne has argued God's perfect goodness is compatible with creating a world with creatures that have libertarian free will. God doesn't transgress any obligations owed to us or to his creatures in creating such a world. And Swinburne thinks this means Sterba needs to show Swinburne's moral intuitions on the relative goodness and evil of different lives and states of affairs are false. So the things we were talking about earlier about privacy and all these different comparable goods Swinburne mentions, Sterba needs to show, no, those really aren't that good. And in light of horrendous evils swamp the goodness of those things, and God shouldn't permit them, even though they are a great good. Without such an argument against Swinburne's value estimations, Sterba isn't justified in establishing a deductive argument from, quote, objective moral truths discoverable or discovered by rational reflection. So this is where we sort of land. And if you've enjoyed this to this point, I really recommend you watch Coffee with Philosophers episode with Jim Sterba. It's lively. And remember, Jim ultimately gets kicked out of the room, which is fun. We could have talked for another couple hours, we realized. So I hope this has been helpful, and we'll see you. Check out that video. It's here.